So recently I was reading, well, actually I did an audiobook of the old Ian Fleming story, Live and Let Die, from one of my favorite Bond movies, Live and Let Die with Roger Moore. And so I was really looking at some of the reviews of that book, and I found some very interesting things that really got me to thinking about how we judge books from the past against today's standards of how we view things. And I'll talk about that next. So, as some of you may know who know me, I'm actually a really big fan of the James Bond films, and I kind of grew up watching them over the years. And I grew up actually when I was really young during the Roger Moore era, and remember watching. I think the first one I watched was For Your Eyes Only, and then Octopussy. So those are a couple from the early 1980s that I remember watching. And then as they would show reruns of some of the ones, I got to discover actually one of my favorite, if not one of my top two favorite Bond movies, which is The Spy Who Loved Me, which is one of my favorites. Also, one of the real early ones with Sean Connery, Goldfinger's another one of my favorites. But always been a big fan of the James Bond films throughout the years, and especially during that Roger Moore era that I was really more familiar with, and also even coming up toward modern times. And I remember watching some of the Timothy Dalton films, Pierce Brosnan, of course, and Daniel Craig today as some of the later Bonds that have been going on. And as I thought about that, I got interested in reading some of the James Bond books from Ian Fleming from back in the day. And so one of the ones that I recently decided that I was going to check out, and I still might actually read the book on Kindle. I did borrow the book on the Kindle device. Haven't had a chance to really read it yet, but I did have a chance to listen to the audiobook over the weekend. And I found it to be really interesting because when you think of when books like that were written, and you're going back into the 50s and the 60s, so a very different era of writing and the way that people saw things, especially in terms of race relations. And if you're familiar with the Live and Let Die film that came out in the mid 70s, or actually early 70s, when you think about that particular Bond film, it really was something that came in during the blaxploitation era, and so it has a lot of those storylines and a lot of those plot lines that are kind of similar to what you would see in some blaxploitation films. And so it was really interesting to me to watch that film over the years, and I really loved watching that film as a kid, going back and watching the reruns of the James Bond films, and this was in the early 80s, and I was listening to or watching some of those reruns of the Bond films, and I really liked that one in particular. I just thought it was a really good story. I thought it was a very interesting story, and it grabbed me right off the bat and just kind of kept me hooked right through the end. And anytime it comes on or I get chances to watch it, I usually take an opportunity to watch it. And when I go on one of my runs of watching James Bond films, I'm actually on one right now. Just got through watching a couple of Pierce Brosnan Bond films. Just watched GoldenEye, which I'd actually never seen GoldenEye, so that was actually kind of fun to watch that one and to get a feel for it. And it was actually a good film. And so Pierce Brosnan is a Bond that people were kind of talking about for a number of years, and maybe hoping was going to follow up the Roger Moore era, though Timothy Dalton came in the middle of that era and actually had a couple of pretty nice films, with License to Kill being one of them, and of course The Living Daylights, which was the other one. But as you look at reading a book that was written in, say, the 1950s or the 1960s or even earlier, and you start to judge it by the standards that we read and watch things today, sometimes things can get lost in translation, and we try to judge too harshly maybe by current standards and have a difficult time putting things in perspective to understand that the period that this story was written or the period that this movie was made is different than what we're in right now. And so I try to, when I am in these situations, to try to judge it with a mix, looking at it through my eyes today and the way that I see things, but also balancing that by understanding the way things were maybe when that book was written or when that movie was made. It doesn't mean that you excuse, for example, racism or sexism or homophobia, but you can understand and look at it in the period of which it was made, and hopefully that will be somewhat of a history lesson for you as you look at that book or you watch that movie through the prism of the time in which it was made. And so the point is, just be cognizant of the fact that the way things were written or made back in the day could be different now. And so try to look at it in the way that it was made, and maybe you can understand a little bit more of the period, and that you can say, well, yeah, that does confirm some things that I was thinking, and it really shows what that period was like and the way that people were thinking back then. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to judge the literary value of a book, or the skill at which a film was made or written, because those things could still be of very high quality, even if you maybe don't like the tone and you don't think the tone fits the values that you have today, or maybe fits even the values that you might have had in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, or 70s. So think about that when you're reading books from an older period of time, or you're watching movies from an older period of time, just to remember that when it was made, times maybe were different and people looked at things very differently. It doesn't mean you can't still have the opinion now, but you want to balance that against, you want to balance how you see things now versus how people saw things then, so you can contextualize a little bit more and hopefully have a better viewing experience or a better reading experience. Doesn't mean you have to endorse everything that's in the book or the way it was written or the tone that it took, but it can help you to understand it better as you try to process it and make a fair-minded judgment about what you read or what you saw.